Your homework is to memorize this and write it 15 times.
Welcome to the coolest, hippest half hour of fun on TV. This is Brain Stew with Jennifer Pulley.
Today, Brain Stew visits Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. Hey, this is a real fort, guys, with a moat and cannons. Cool. Fort Monroe has been here in Virginia for almost 200 years. Plus, we'll find out what important people stayed inside Fort Monroe and why. Don't touch that remote. Brain Stew is next. Hey you, on the couch, welcome to this week's episode of Brain Stew. I'm Jennifer Pulley. Is your brain ready to be stewed or what? Mine is. You know, when I was little, I used to play fort in my backyard. It was so cool. My little sister, she couldn't get in unless she had a secret password. That's not it. Go away. Today, we are in Hampton, Virginia, at a real fort. Fort Monroe. I mean, it's real. Not like my fort that I used to build in my backyard. Almost 200 years ago, it was built. You know, I don't think my backyard fort would have held up this long. But, well, 200 years ago, Fort Monroe was very different from what you see today. Now, you see, there was this war going on, and it was during the year of 1812. It was called the War of 1812. Get it? Anyway, the British and the Americans were fighting during this war. Now, the British Navy sailed down the Chesapeake and attacked and burned the city of Washington, D.C. Here's a convenient map that we can look at right here, the Chesapeake Bay. The Navy just came right on in and burned the city of Washington, which we know now as Washington, D.C. It was at that point that the Americans realized, oh my gosh, we gotta protect ourselves because we're gonna keep getting attacked by the British. So they built, ta-da, 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 Fort Monroe. Cool. Oh, well, hey, does anybody know what time it is?
Yeah, it's 9:10.
Thanks. I meant what time is it? It's time for history lesson, that's what time it is. Fort Monroe was named after President James Monroe of Virginia. Let me show you him. This dude right here, James Monroe. Now, he was president of the United States of America from 1817 until 1825. He was a pretty important man. I mean, important enough to have a fort named after him. Now, Fort Monroe was named after President James Monroe.
Why was Fort Monroe built?
Well, it was built to protect the Hampton Roads harbor area from attacks by the water. Remember, like I said before about the British, they didn't want them attacking, so they built this fort. Bet you didn't know this. Fort Monroe is the largest stone fort ever built in the United States. Pretty cool. Look at this cool aerial picture of Fort Monroe. That means it was taken from the air. The inner fort was begun in 1819, and it is surrounded by a moat. See any alligators in this moat? Maybe I've been reading too many books, huh? Anyway, it took 15 years for the Americans to complete Fort Monroe. In 1834, it was completed. Fort Monroe was not only built for protection from attacks by the water, but it was also a place where soldiers came and learned how to fight. Soldiers like Edgar Allan Poe.
Hey, wasn't he a famous poet?
He sure was, and you know, Robert E. Lee was also here.
Didn't he become a famous general for the Confederates?
He sure did. Now, years after the War of 1812, there was another war called the Civil War. And this was the war between the northern and the southern states. America was really divided in half. Now, President Abraham Lincoln, he was president of the United Northern States. And President Jefferson Davis was president of the Southern States, or the Confederacy. During the Civil War, Fort Monroe was under control of the North. Yep, it's a fort built in the South. However, it was controlled by the North at the time. Now, in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln came and stayed right here in this house. Why? He came because he was going to oversee the attack on Norfolk. The North were going to attack Norfolk, which is right over there. And he was coming down to check it out and see if they were going to do it. Meanwhile, the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, was captured in Georgia, and he was brought right here to Fort Monroe. The North thought Jefferson Davis was plotting to kill Lincoln. Can you believe it? They kept him prisoner right here. We're going to see where that was in just a second. Okay, kids, time's up. That's the end of your history lesson. Did you get all that?
Got it.
I mean, as you can see, Fort Monroe is still in use today. I mean, people actually live inside Fort Monroe. That's so cool. Now, we are going to go inside Fort Monroe and visit a place called the Casemate Museum.
Wow.
My friend Dennis is waiting for us because he wants to fill our brain with all this information about the Casemate Museum in Fort Monroe. So we're going to go right through the Sally Port and go right on inside and find the Casemate Museum. Come on.
Hi, Jennifer.
Good morning. Well,
It's
I'm
good to see you.
so excited to be here at Fort Monroe. This is great. This is called the Casemate Museum?
This is called the Casemate Museum.
What's a casemate?
Casemate, very simply, is a room, like you see here, within the walls of a fort. And you can use that room for any number of purposes. And we show some of those purposes here at the museum.
It's inside the fort right now, so we're inside the wall.
We're right inside the walls of the fort, and it was built this way to perform certain specific functions. And that's how we got our name. First off, casemates can be used normally as gun positions. You would mount guns within these rooms.
Is that what some
And that's what we show some of over here. But you could also use a casemate for living quarters.
People live
People
in
could
rooms
live
like
here,
this?
yes, and we talk about that here in the museum.
What guns are used at Fort Monroe?
We were built between 1819 and 1834.
Yeah.
So we're talking about back in the days of muzzle-loading artillery. Very limited range on these pieces. Guns like these, what are called 32-pounders, because that's the weight of the shot that they fired. The range was only a mile, just a little bit over, actually.
It's not very tall.
You see that nice, long, low structure out there?
Yep.
That's Fort Wool, as we call it today. Back in the days when it was first built, it was Fort Calhoun, because he was the Secretary of the War at the time that it was built.
And the 32-pounders you said would shoot, and they would go about that distance?
They would have reached just a little bit farther than that.
Wow.
Okay, about a mile. Not very far
Well,
in
compared to what we
comparison
have today.
Today, that's right. But for back then, it was just enough. Between this fort and Fort Wool, we were able to block off that shipping channel very effectively.
1 mile. Perfect.
1 mile.
Okay, now, how would this work? If we were soldiers and we were going to shoot this 32-pounder, I mean, how would you do it?
You would have had a crew of 5 men. One of them would have come forward carrying a powder charge, gunpowder already in a bag, would have handed it to 2 men at the front. They would have rammed it home down into the breech area back here.
Okay.
That same man then would have reached down, picked up a 32-pounder cannonball, handed it to one of the men in front. He would have put it into the muzzle. The 2 of them would have rammed that down into the breech then. Meanwhile, the gun captain is getting everything ready. He's got 2 other men who are swinging this gun back and forward on these rails.
So this
that
gun
he
actually
lines
will
it up.
move, so it
He could
moves.
move, swing back and forth. At the same time, he's also turning this handle, setting the elevation. He then takes a long wire called a gimlet, puts it down through the vent, bursts open that bag, puts what we would call a friction primer into here, kind of like a cigarette lighter would work, a piece of flint against steel.
Yep.
Runs a lanyard off of that, hands it to another man, and when he has everything lined up, ready to fire, he tells that man to pull the lanyard. That sets the spark, sets the gunpowder off, and of course the cannonball goes flying.
Okay, now Dennis, you said a casemate was used to house guns, which we just saw, and you said it was also used to house people? People lived in casemates?
People lived in casemates, and that's what you see here at this part of the museum.
Look at this, this looks like a little home.
It was a home, but here's what was happening. By the time you get to the Civil War, you've got many thousands of soldiers who are coming here. Some of them are bringing their families. You've got to have some place for them to live. Just prior to the Civil War, those guns that we saw when we first entered the museum had become obsolete. So they've been taken out. Now you have all these empty rooms, and you've got to house all those soldiers. What the government did, the Army, was to decide that if we have empty rooms and we've got a lot of soldiers, sounds like a good match. So they turned all of these casemates into living quarters, and they remained as living quarters for officers and senior non-commissioned officers right up through the early 1950s.
Dennis, I'm a little confused. Fort Monroe was controlled by the North, but it's here in the South. How could that be?
Well, it's really quite easy. Here's our Virginia Peninsula, Fort Monroe sitting down here at the tip. Right across from that, you've got Fort Calhoun, as it was called in the early days. Chesapeake Bay comes down and it enters into the Atlantic Ocean.
Exactly.
And then the Chesapeake Bay flows through here into what we call Hampton Roads. Fort Monroe and Fort Wool protected the cities of Norfolk, Portsmouth, which in those days had the Navy Yard at Gosport, Suffolk, a seaport city, and Richmond.
Sure.
Which even today is still a seaport. When you get to the Civil War, however, what's happening? You've got the South, which needs to trade with the outside world to carry on its war effort. These two forts, then, if they stay in Union hands, can prevent any shipping from coming out from all of these cities. So right away, the North knew that they wanted to control Fort Monroe. In addition to that, you get into the fact that Richmond becomes the capital of the Confederacy.
Absolutely.
And so now you've got Fort Monroe only about 85 land miles away from your enemy's capital.
Who was the president of the Confederacy? Jefferson Davis, right? Right. Well, guess what? Jefferson Davis stayed here at Fort Monroe. I don't know if it was very nice, though.
Where did Jefferson Davis stay when he was at Fort Monroe?
Well, good questions. He was here at Fort Monroe because he was a prisoner. No, his stay here wasn't very nice as far as he was concerned, and he was here for about 2 years. And the cell that he stayed in is actually the very heart of this museum, and it's right around the corner.
We can see where he stayed?
Oh, yes.
Cool. This is it, Dennis?
This is it. This is the very room that Jefferson stayed in, Jefferson Davis stayed in.
It's not too nice here, Dennis.
Not too nice, and it certainly was not very nice for him.
Yeah, why was he here? I mean, why do you keep saying that it wasn't very nice for him? He didn't want to be here?
No, he definitely didn't want to be here, and let's remember what's happening. 1865, the Civil War is coming to an end, and he's captured in Georgia by federal troops, and he's almost immediately brought up to here. As soon as he's captured, there are people at the fort who are given instructions to turn this cell, this casemate, into a cell to hold him. So when he arrives on the 19th of May, he's on board of a steamer. He waits 3 days, and then the commanding general of the fort goes to the steamer, brings him ashore through a double line of soldiers, and he's walked all the way down, and here he comes. Now, he's charged with 3 crimes: treason against the United States. He's charged with maltreatment of Union prisoners of war.
Okay.
Of course, the prison camps in the South are just being opened up, and Union soldiers are seeing the conditions that their comrades have been living in.
Do they think he tried to kill President Lincoln or tried
And that's the third thing that he's tried with: complicity in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. They figure that he is the president of the Confederacy,
So he'd be
must have known about, if he didn't have a direct hand in, Lincoln's assassination.
This is very barren. I mean, not much to do in here.
Not much to do. He wasn't allowed to have very much. He was allowed to have a Bible and a prayer book.
Yeah.
Eventually, he was allowed to have a pipe with some tobacco.
So, like, no Nintendo, no television.
No
PC.
Nintendo, no television, none of that thing.
Well,
Stop
he
and
had
think
it
about
bad.
it. There wasn't even any air conditioning. We feel fairly comfortable in here right now.
Yeah.
But he remains here for 2 years as a prisoner at Fort Monroe. He's not released until May of 1867. Never brought to trial. He's simply released when $100,000 is posted for him as a bail.
And at that point, the war is over. The Civil War has ended, and
Well,
the South has lost.
The South has lost. The Civil War is over for 2 years. Jefferson Davis travels abroad for a while, but eventually he returns back to his home in Mississippi and lives out the remainder of his life there.
Hey, check out this model of Fort Monroe. Dennis, this is so cool. Tell me, why is Fort Monroe shaped like this? It's kind of weird looking.
Well, it's kind of weird looking, but it's got a very definite reason why it has this shape. It's not just haphazard. So here's Fort Monroe sitting on this piece of low-lying land down at the bottom of the peninsula, right where Hampton Roads comes in.
Okay, this is like the harbor, the Hampton Roads Harbor.
That's right.
Okay.
So what you see then is this piece of military engineering is going to answer both of those purposes. These bastions, these kind of diamond-shaped areas, those are projecting outward from these straight areas called fronts. If you take a look at these fronts and bastions, you'll see the little doorways in there. It means that those are all the casemates that hold the guns.
I see them.
All along here, out to the seaward side. And in addition, they come around and connect with this building, which was called the water battery. That housed an additional 40 guns.
Wow.
So if an enemy was going to attack, they would have been picked up by the first gun all the way out here and followed in a continuous arc of fire all around the fronts.
If they would make it that far.
If they would have made it that far.
This is all that's left of the water battery that Dennis was showing us in the model. This used to protect the fort from attacks by water. It became obsolete. This is all that's left.
That's how it performed its primary mission.
How did Fort Monroe protect itself?
Well, again, these bastions come into play here. Because if you are an enemy who's coming in to attack this fort,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter where you're coming from. When you come up to the moat, which is built for defensive purposes, you're going to have to slow down your attack, get out into the open, and come right under the direct fire of riflemen who can be posted in these bastions and take you under a very deadly crossfire. No matter where you attack from, you'll be caught in a crossfire from at least 2 sides, maybe even 3.
How big is Fort Monroe?
The fort is the largest stone fort ever built in the United States. It's got a circumference around the top of the ramparts of about 1 1/3 miles.
Wow, that's a big fort.
Did Edgar Allan Poe stay at Fort Monroe?
Oh, the poet.
That's right, the poet, the author, the critic. He becomes famous later, but he serves here as a soldier when he's a very young man. His story, to go over it very quickly, is that he joins the Army up in Boston because he joins at Fort Independence, which is an artillery fort. He goes into the artillery. Eventually, his career brings him to Fort Monroe, and that's in December of 1828. Edgar Allan Poe is leaving the Army at almost the same time Robert E. Lee is graduating from West Point.
Wow.
He's commissioned as an officer, a lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers, and then he's sent down to Fort Monroe 2 years later to help on the construction of the fort. Remember, construction is going on between 1819 and 1834.
That's right. So he's helping build Fort Monroe.
He's helping build Fort Monroe between 1831 and 1834.
Now, where did Robert E. Lee stay when he was here at Fort Monroe? Did he stay in a casemate?
No, he didn't stay in a casemate. Back in those days, he still had the guns in here, so they weren't using these as actual living quarters at that time. He lived in a very fine set of quarters directly across the street. Remember, he's an officer, and even though he's only a second lieutenant, nonetheless, there is at that time a very great remove between the officers and the enlisted soldiers.
Okay, Dennis, we talked about the history of Fort Monroe. It's still standing today.
Who lives at Fort Monroe today?
Well, it's still an active Army post, and there are about almost 3,000 soldiers and civilians who live and work here every day.
Wow.
There's still people who live here, and there are some major offices of our Army that are here now. Since 1973, this has been the home for one of the Army's major commands. It's called the Training and Doctrine Command. What goes on within TRADOC? You have the training function, one of the first points of its very name. In addition to that, the doctrine side is how is it that our soldiers and our leaders are expected to fight? What are the things that they need to know, and what are the things that they are expected to be able to perform as they go out into combat?
Dennis, thank you so much for all the information on Fort Monroe. You stuffed my brain. It's full now.
Okay, well, Jennifer, it's been my pleasure. I'm really glad that Brian Sue was able to be here.
You heard it right from him. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dennis. Bye.
Bye now.
The moat at Fort Monroe contains salt water that is filtered in from Mills Creek, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Atlantic Ocean. However, the moat has less salt water than the Atlantic Ocean. What would happen if you mixed the ocean water with the water from the moat? Let's find out. Now go grab these materials, but make sure you ask your mom or dad first, please. Glass bowl, table salt, a measuring spoon, food coloring, a cup, and water. Here's the plan. Fill the cup about 3/4 full with water. Next, add 6 tablespoons of salt to the water and stir. Pour in drops of food coloring to make the water a very deep blue. This water represents the Atlantic Ocean. Fill the glass bowl half full with water. Next, add 2 tablespoons of salt to the glass bowl and stir. This water represents the water in the moat. Slowly pour the blue water down the side of the glass bowl. check out what happened. As you can see, the blue water, or the ocean water, sinks to the bottom of the bowl. Why did this happen? I'll tell you. Density measures the mass or heaviness of materials. A density current is the movement of water due to the difference in the density of water. All water that comes from the sea contains salt, but when two bodies of water mix, the water with the most salt will move under the lighter, less salty water. Because the Atlantic Ocean is more salty than the water in the moat at Fort Monroe, when we mix the two together, the blue ocean water drops to the bottom.
Well, kids, that's the show for this week. As always, I have filled my expanding brain with facts about the Civil War and especially about Fort Monroe. Until then, you keep that large brain of yours stewing. That's in order. And I'll see you next week. Bye. As always, I've filled my expanding brain with information on the Civil War and especially my stumbles.
However, the moat...
That again.
It's stuck in there. Okay. Good. Did El... This is funny. Hey, wasn't he a famous... Wasn't he a famous... What would happen if we mix the ocean water with the
With the mo.
with the that works.
Fort Monroe was not only a place, it was not only built. Sorry. Sure was, and Robert E. Lee. Sure. Oh, sorry. Cut you off. No, my fault. I cut. Perfect. Stay.
And don't forget Fort McHenry.
Yeah.
Yeah?